William Butler Yeats. William Butler Yeats, or W.B. Yeats as I will be referring to him in the rest of the video, was born in Dublin. In his earlier period, his dramatic production outweighs his poetry, both in bulk and in import. Together with Lady Gregory, who was his lifelong friend and a patron, he founded the Irish Theatre, which was to become the Abbey Theatre as we now know it today. Although a convinced patriot, Yeats deplored the hatred and the bigotry of the nationalist movement, and his poetry is full of moving protests against it. His recurrent themes in his poetry are that of art and life, masks, cyclical theories of life, immortality, and the ideal of beauty. Many critics see Yeats as a metaphysic. But in what sense is he a metaphysics, really? First, his idea of the unity of being. It is inspired from the metaphysics, majorly by Donne's union of the spiritual and the sensual. Another metaphysical technique that Yeats uses is the extended metaphor, which link the inner and the outer, the abstract and the concrete. He modified the metaphysical conceit. He used the paradox to develop the proposition that hatred of God may bring the soul to God. In fact, his use of extended metaphors can be seen with two examples. First, in Easter 1916, the phrase, "the hearts with one purpose alone, sacrificed to long for Irish nationalism." They are compared to an unchanging stone in the midst of the living stream, while horses and Houlihans live and change minute by minute around it. Another example can be seen by his treatment of the body-soul dilemma as he refers to himself in Monuments of Unaging Intellect. Yeats considered Byzantium as a symbol of art's transcendence, of change, and he asks to be gathered into an artifice of eternity, and imagines himself to be the emperor's artificial bird of golden handiwork. But the funny thing is, he demands this out of an empire which is already fallen. So he demands eternity out of a transient empire. The third thing that made Yeats a metaphysic was his drift towards his theory of the masks. You see, Yeats' poetry became more whole and rounded as he drifted towards his theory of masks, which demanded that he approach experience as though he was also his opposite. Most of Yeats' life had gone in him looking for the antithesis, the antithetical. He insisted that poetry should simultaneously be passionate and cold. And this idea of the paradox that we discussed before is exactly this idea that masks, or his theory of masks, also believes in. He believes that people are two, one that is the internal and one that is the external. And between them lays a mask. So the theory of the mask says that one is always playing a role. We're not actually that. We're just pretending to be that. Yeats' poetic seeks a balance between this surface and depth, between the mask of the human face and the personality that is hidden beneath that human face. So these are the three ways in which Yeats is a metaphysic. First, his idea of the unity of being, which combines the sensual with the spiritual. Second, his idea of the extended metaphor, which has been turned into a paradox by comparing two antithetical things together. And three, his idea of the mask, which again compares two different things together, but this time it believes that all of this is occurring because of a mask. Yeats has also been seen as a romantic. He started his long literary career as a romantic poet in 1880s, where he focused on love, longing, and loss. Now here are a few things that make him a great romantic. 1. He focused on imagination, not reason. In a letter, Yeats gives his objections to George Eliot in just these terms. Tito, her most famous character, is as interesting as a cat on a vivisection table. George Eliot is analytic, moralistic, argumentative. She's not synthetic, religious, and passionate. She is too reasonable. I hate reasonable people. The activity of their brain sucks up all the blood out of their hearts. So for Yeats, as for many other romantics, what made a poet was imagination, the literal power of conceiving images of the truth. The great counter-truth was explanation, the habit of the mind that did not see a rose, but described it in terms of its relation to other roses, which valued it only for its utility. For a poet, Yeats believed that this is a backward way of getting at truth, because it substitutes abstraction for experience, the head for the heart. Yeats wanted to become an archetype of a poet. His father was his mentor and his antagonist, and Yeats wanted to prove that investigation of occult lore and membership in patriotic societies were not a waste of his time. And beyond his father lay a world agreeably complicit to the non-existence of poetry. People didn't care if poetry didn't exist anymore or if art was gone. And Yeats might scorn this world, but some inner pride would not permit him to leave this world alone. In order to persuade that poetry matters, he must show its power to affect the destinies of all men. And so he made himself into a mythical figure, the archetype of a poet. In fact, he spent years building this elaborate abstract system in a vision. Second is his idea of dependence on formalism and not abstraction. One aspect of unity of being was full imaginative identification with your race. And as an artist, Yeats delighted that in every age there was a poet who confined themselves gladly to some inherited subject matter which was known to the whole people. Because he believed that in a man and a race alike, there is something called the unity of being. So he was using the term as Dante had used it when he compared beauty in Convicto to a perfectly proportioned human body. Abstraction was false, it was ugly, because it destroyed wholeness. And certainly, throughout his career, aesthetic considerations came first for Yeats, and these aesthetic considerations were made out of wholeness. If we talk about the wholeness of Yeats' poetry, we can understand it better when we talk about Yeats' aversion to fragmentation that modernism offered. He said, "I thought that all art should be a centaur, finding in the popular lore its back and its strong legs. But the world, now a bundle of fragments, had begun to break up shortly before the birth of Shakespeare." Third, his mythological symbolism was also based on romantic ideas. The unity of being required the imaginative capacity to see a different state of affairs, and see it with such longing that the deepest sources of energy would be released from its attainment. Yeats came to see this as nations, races, and individual men who were unified by an image, a symbol, because only the greatest obstacle that can be contemplated without despair rouses the will to full intensity. But it doesn't mean that Yeats was completely an anti-modernist. There are some modernist elements in his poetry, like in the Song of the Happy Shepherd, where the shepherd bemoans the death of the antique pastoral world and warns against worshipping the truth of the astronomers, whose scientific zeal has killed their human truth. 4. Truth and poetry. The relation between truth and poetry was a central problem for the Romantics. To establish that relationship, it was necessary to create the image and to invent a strategy for persuading others of its truth. Wordsworth's idea of the poet as a man speaking to other men was still vital for Yeats. It presented a double challenge. He must make of himself a man who could speak out of richness of humanity, and he must find a language not necessarily used by other men, but one which they could not fail to understand. Perhaps part of the reason for Yeats' greatness is that these two imperatives were more closely connected for him than they have been for most other poets. 5. Transforming triviality into significance. Yeats had hankered after a secret ritual, which would wipe out the ugliness of the present and magically transform dullness and triviality into a noble, luminous significance. When he came across the concept of anima mundi, described by Platonic philosophers and then in the 17th century by Henry Moore, Yeats thought that he had discovered both the source and the explanation of all those great images which have a peculiar power to touch the hearts of men. Now, anima mundi means the soul of the world, literally. It is a religious and philosophical concept. Philosophical because it believes that the world is animated by a soul, similar to the human body, and that all living beings are intrinsically connected. and religious because it meant that this vital force that was permeating the entire world, it was maybe God or the supreme being. Anima mundi is the storehouse of great images and thoughts and symbols. These symbols that never die, but they remain subconsciously inside our subconscious until someone has the trick of drawing them out. The great unifying images of mankind are there, and we respond to their power without being able to explain it. 6. Yeats' anger towards the urban middle class and his love for countryside people. Now here you can find the reference to the elegy written in a country churchyard by Thomas Gray. Because who is the common enemy in both of them? It is all those restless, unsettled people who confuse excitement with emotion and controversy with intellect. Typically, it is that urban middle class which has lost touch with the age-old rhythm of life, the kind of life enforced on the peasant. From a poet's standpoint, their minds were uncorrupted. They still saw and heard things they believed in. Their religion was a matter of vision, not of abstraction. 7. The irony of being a romantic. Yeats' irony is wholly modern, at least by 1920, but his response to it is not. Instead of the self-depreciating skepticism that so characteristically accompanies the ironic tone in modern poetry, Yeats announces his unpleasant finding to us with all the savage grandeur of an Old Testament prophet. His poetry shows how deeply the ethos of aristocratic ceremony had entered his work, and it is his unwillingness to relinquish the traditional claim of the poet to be a seer that sets him apart from most of his contemporaries. 8. Roughness of form. The poetry often seems impatient to make its point, and therefore frequently it is content with roughness of form and crudity of content. In a poem like Lapis Lazuli, the poem is tragedy. Not only poetic tragedy, but the tragedy inseparable from human life. The poet answers those who are sick of the frivolous gaiety of the arts by defending the power of heroic gaiety. Hamlet and Lear are gay because they go beyond catastrophe to achieve greatness. It is only those capable of heroic gaiety who have the energy and courage to build the fallen things again. The emphasis throughout this poem shifts from the strenuous Occidental approach of trying actively to wrest a victory from time to the more patient and cunning Oriental approach of detaching oneself until the tragic scene comes into focus and passionate chaos assumes the clear and serene order of a work of art. Yeats' romanticism combines a rebellion against whatever serves to diminish the value of man in his own eyes with a clear sense that the battle he's fighting is a losing one. By the very description of the artifact, the lapis lazuli, that contains the scene, Yeats brings into relief the human meaning to the scene itself. What lay behind the words is a sense of ineradicable truths of the heart that stubbornly resist idealization or abstraction, that suffer the ravages of time, and they are yet indestructible. His determination not to betray these truths perhaps accounts for the tone of hard and reckless gaiety in some of the last poems. But his early conception of the poet as a man committed to high responsibilities to himself was never abandoned. It only deepened as Yeats learned to understand himself better. Two things: a kind of fury of the heart and a conviction that beauty could be born of this fury put him with the last romantics. Finally, now let's talk about two concepts that Yeats usually talked about: anima mundi and spiritus mundi. Let's start with anima mundi. Anima mundi literally means world soul. It is a philosophical and religious idea. It's philosophical because it believes that the world has a soul of its own, and everyone in this world is connected by that one unified soul. The Hermetic worldview suggests that understanding and aligning oneself with the world soul can lead to spiritual enlightenment and union with the divine. The religious concept believes that this world soul is God or Supreme Being. Hinduism also contributed to the concept of anima mundi through the idea of the Brahman, a soul that can teach the true nature of humanity. Spiritus mundi is a little different. Literally, it means world spirit. but it is used to describe the collective soul of the universe that contains memories of all times. This is usually believed to serve as a muse or an inspiration for writers, providing images and symbols, and acting as a kind of collective unconsciousness. For example, in The Second Coming, Yeats attributes the speaker's vision of a beast in the desert to Spiritus Mundi. And this is all that you had to know for starting to understanding Yeats. Of course, he is a complex poet, and there's much more about him than what all I've discussed, but I've tried to compact everything into this small video. If you like this video, check out this list of other modernist poets